Well, good evening and happy Shabbat. Welcome to Yada Yahweh Radio. This evening, fellas, I'd like to begin with the news. We haven't done a significant segment of news in a while, and our review of Chapter 4 of Coming Home in Our Time is really gets into some technical details. So just to kind of keep this show a bit grounded, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to talk about the news and get your guys' input. You're probably aware that, and I understand, Kirk, that you've had your hands filled with Terry, and so catching bits and segments of the news is probably not very easy for you at this time. But Germany experienced I guess we'd call it a mass shooting. 9 people were gunned down by a conspirator. He is called a right-wing racist, and clearly he was a racist. I don't like the term right and left-wing because the difference between fascism and communism, or fascism and socialism, is so minute, particularly between fascism and socialism, is so minute to refer to them as extremes just shows an ignorance of these particular economic schemes. And this man was not motivated by politics. No, I think I will prove, just based on some of his statements, that his principal problem is that he was an ignoramus. That I know it's not politically correct, but these are not times that we should be politically correct. He was a mental retard. He killed because, well, he's a mental retard. Now, people don't want to say that, but that's the truth. Some of the headlines read, Germany will deploy extra police to protect mosques, railroad stations, airports, and other sensitive sites because of a very high far-right threat following the Hanau killings, the Interior Minister says. Horst Schoeffer said that he had agreed to these measures with regional leaders to prevent any copycat attacks. Now, would you please tell me why there would be a copycat attack? I mean, this is a moron that killed himself. He killed his mother, and his manifesto makes him look like he's an absolute idiot. And you can't even read it directly. You only can read snippets of it. So it's even hard to find the man's last name. Why would anybody want to copy that? So in his rambling, this should say that Mr. Schoeffer said that the biggest security threat facing Germany now is right-wing extremism. Right-wing extremism. Yep. In his rambling manifesto, Rothgen, which is this fellow's name, the mental retard's name. He is an absolute idiot. I mean, it is. Listen, to be an advocate of conspiracies, you have to be stupid. They are so easily disproved, and almost all of them are the opposite of what is true. And this guy just happens to be the prototypical moron in advancing these ridiculous ideas. Anyway, Rothgen describes his fears of having been placed under government surveillance, and he blamed the government surveillance for his failure to copulate with women. So, you want us to believe that you, a complete and utter moron who is now a mass murderer and, by the way, dead, and a man that killed his own mother, you want us to believe that the security forces of Germany are secretly controlling you, not so they can keep you from killing people, but to keep you from copulating. you know,
Okay.
one of the things, and I'm sorry for laughing, but what are you going to do?
No, you can't make this stuff up. Are you kidding?
Yeah. I spent a lot of time debunking conspiracies because, well, quite frankly, I was disgusted that that people who claim to have read my books and to be members of the Covenant family were not only advancing the most absurd conspiracies, the Building 7 conspiracy, that it was an inside job, that vaccines are a secret government plot, the Alex Jones stupidity of every time there's a mass murder in this country, it's actually government actors that are putting it on, that the Boston bombing at the marathon was a government plot and Sandy Hook was a government plot, that kind of nonsense, or that the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria was secretly a slave den for pedophiles that was run by the Clintons, or that the condensation trails that come out of jet engines at 30,000 feet was the means the government was using to poison us. All of it is stupid. And of course, the problem is, beyond having idiots then use the terminology that I have learned from translating the Torah, but also in the midst of my translations, it degrades Yahweh's words. Just to have these idiots vomit all over them with their conspiracy theories. So it is deeply troubling. And it was deeply troubling that conspiracy now is the fastest growing religion in the world. 40% of the world's population believes in conspiracies. And the most basic of all conspiracies is blame the Jews. This idiot was one of those. He wanted to wipe out every Jew on the planet. And what's always amazing is these idiots are so stupid. They claim that the Jews are trying to wipe out the white race, not recognizing that Jews are Caucasians. But beyond that, it is Gentiles who for the last 2,000 years have done everything they could possibly do to wipe out Jews, and Jews have done nothing to wipe out Gentiles.
No. Gosh.
Well, this fellow had it bad. See, we now have ethnic groups. This is what he wrote: ethnic groups, races, or cultures. By the way, what is the difference in an ethnic group and a race?
None.
Nothing.
Okay. We have ethnic groups, races, or cultures in our midst that are destructive in every respect. By the way, there is no such thing as a race that is destructive in every respect. One of the things that I've tried to do, and
there are individuals
really
who are.
Yes.
Correct.
It is extremely important that we recognize that when you blanket blame an ethnicity, what you're doing is exposing yourself as someone who cannot think. Skin color and genetics are not responsible for behavior. Religions, politics, conspiracies, patriotism, those things are responsible for actions, most of them bad. It is appropriate to expose and condemn a religion that motivates bad behavior. I began a series of books that hates a virtue. And that sounds so shocking to people's ears because, like Merkel right after this says, hate is our enemy. We must stop hate. Well, no, your problem is you don't know what to hate. You don't know how important it is to despise political, conspiratorial, and religious ideals that motivate people to do despicable things. You ought to hate not only pedophiles and pedophilia, rape and rapists, murder and mass murderers. You ought to hate anything that inspires many people to do these things. including the conspiracies behind them, including the religions behind them, including the politics behind them. So there is no such thing as an ethnic group being destructive in every way. And there is, even if we were to look at religions, a religion cannot garner credibility by being entirely wrong. It's just like a counterfeit bill. A counterfeit bill has to show be created such that the majority of his strokes look appropriate. Otherwise, no one's going to believe it. But it's still a fake. Now, my ex, for example, had this terrible habit of taking something out of context, misrepresenting it, twisting it such that it made my motives look heinous when in context, and what was actually said was actually quite good. She just did this with reckless abandon. Well, one of the problems was that there was always an element of truth to what she said. It's just that the truth of what she said was taken out of a context where it was positive and put into a context where it was negative. And so we have to recognize that it is half lies. It is partial truths that are so destructive. It's not the outright lie because they're not credible. So what he said here shows that he has no capacity to understand what's happening around him. And he said that as a result, he envisioned a rough cleansing first and then a fine cleansing. His view was that you would wipe out half the world's population, and that would be cleansing. The following people, he said, must be completely exterminated: Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Israel, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, the complete Arab Peninsula, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and the Philippines. Last time I checked, those were countries, not people. And if you're going to write the Philippines, how could you not write Indonesia? Particularly if your thing is against Muslims, why would you write the Philippines as opposed to Indonesia? What have you got against Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam? If Pakistan is your problem, then why list India? Because they're opposites. What happened the two times that America tried to wipe out the Afghanis?
Quagmire.
How well did that turn out? He said, I would eliminate all these people. Even if we're speaking about billions of people, it has to be done. Why? Why? Because you're a complete failure at life. And by the way, that is the only common denominator among conspiratorials. They're failures at life. This guy was 50 years old. He had never been on a date. 50 years, complete and utter loser. That's why he became an advocate of conspiracies. He needed something to blame for his failures. It is the one common thread among all of them. They have to come up with an excuse as to why their lives suck. And so he wanted to blame everybody else. Oh, but he claimed credit for some things. He said the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were his ideas. Yep. He also said
so
that
he had some bad
the movie
ideas and somebody stole them.
Yep. He said that the movie Starship Troopers and Look Who's Talking. Now, Starship Troopers is so bad it's funny. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie.
Oh yeah. That's just so bad it's good film.
It is so stunningly bad that the movie's hilarious, but not because it intended to be hilarious. And Look Who's Talking. Isn't that about a 2-year-old that starts jibber jabbering?
An infant, and it's all in his head. It's a funny movie. It's a good comedy. Grew up watching it as a kid. But...
He also said that he approved of Donald Trump. He says, I doubt that Donald Trump knowingly implements my recommendations. But he suggested that his mind control was at work. So the reason we're laughing here is that the Germans are saying the problem is right-wing extremism. Now, I'm going to tell you there's a problem with the neo-Nazi movement.
Stupid.
But it's no more right-wing than Stalin was left-wing. But the problem here is that this person was psychotic. It was deeply disturbed psychologically. And that really is, in America with the mass shootings, it is almost always the common denominator is that the person has a psychiatric problem. And then you combine that with an indoctrination in political correctness where there's no sense of right and wrong. And then you combine that with a culture of interacting through social media where there's no direct contact with people. And you're vicariously examining and living and exposing lives. And then you and where somebody writes something and the person who wrote it is striving for likes, but not for a discussion. They're striving for likes. And then you have video games where you can reboot if you get killed. It's that culture, that environment that is breeding ever more of these monsters. And we don't get it. We also don't understand why those who think that the right way to deal with Islam is with bullets and bombs, as opposed to words wielded wisely, they have no concept of how much worse they're making a situation. Ever resort to violence. If you resort to violence, which is what this idiot did, and you go off and kill people like the kid did in New Zealand, if that is your cause, you are destroying your cause. You are going to get the opposite. You're going to get people rallying around those that you would like to expel. What you're doing is counterproductive. That's stupid. And you're giving up your life to do it. Now, he began, I did watch his, the beginning of his video that he produced the day before he went on the rampage, and it was addressed to all Americans. And what he told us in America was that we're being played for fools, that the government is secretly controlling all of our minds. Now, this is a government that can't run a post office. This is a government that couldn't count and went into Iraq thinking that we could install democracy, and we just gave Iraq to Iran. You know, this is a government whose Democrats are now engaged in debates where the only winner is Donald Trump. And yet he wants us to believe, and he told us, that this very same government is controlling everybody's minds. And they're doing it, by the way, from secret underground military bases. And in those military bases, the reason that people are in them is because there are children sex slaves. And what they're doing, when they're not taking advantage of little children, is they're worshiping the devil. I bet you guys didn't know that.
No, I didn't, as a matter of fact. This is sick.
Where do they have time to control every single individual's mind? I mean, that's a lot of people.
Man, I tell you what.
Sex and devil worship.
It's a 24-page manifesto, and I had one person say, you know, this person wasn't an idiot. There wasn't a single grammatical mistake in 24 pages. He's been to university. He's about 50 years old. Now, I think he's 43 is the record. Now, he had no encounters with police. He actually did not have any encounters with domestic intelligence agencies. He was just a quiet little racist until he decided to walk into a smoking lounge and shoot everybody up.
That amazes me.
There's more to it, but I think you get the idea. He does, by the way, think that he says the letter delves into the deep question of whether or not the complete annihilation of entire countries. You don't annihilate a country. You annihilate people. Can be legitimate when the United States will be replaced as a global superpower, and the technologies will do most to transform the 21st century, he says. The future role will be played out by China, who features prominently in this manifesto. I just read it and you want to shake your head. The answer is to whatever degree this man had any capacity to think rationally, which was probably marginal, he lost what little capacity he had in the going down the rabbit hole of conspiracies. It is a extremely dangerous undertaking. If you are prone to conspiracy, please go away. We want nothing to do with you. You're dangerous. You're a danger to yourself. You're a danger to your society. And quite frankly, you are more difficult to reason with than a person who is passionately religious. Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's pretty obvious. In fact, even the Democrats are acknowledging it now that Donald Trump is the only person winning the Democratic debate. America, however, is losing. I read the other day that 45% of Americans, which would be most Democrats, would actually favor electing a socialist. And by the way, the man supported every communist on the planet. So he's called himself a communist. He really is a communist. It's just that it sounds better to call himself a socialist. And I just wonder if those 45% of Americans, have they ever looked at the difference between East and West Germany? I was there. I've been in both East and West Germany when there was a separate Germany. And I want to tell you, it was as black and white as you could imagine countries. This was the same place, the same people, the same language, the same culture, and you had on the communist socialist side total and complete poverty, no freedom, miserable lives. And on the other side, you had prosperity and hope and development, opportunity and freedom. You want to see the difference between free enterprise and socialism, just compare East and West Germany from 1945 to 1985, that 40 years. I'm sure you guys have looked at it.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
There is no other way to explain it other than free enterprise works, socialism does not.
No.
Why would this 45% compare the Soviet Union to the United States in the 40 years after World War II? Why not compare Poland to Denmark or England? Or why not just compare post and pre-socialist Poland? Poland during the time it was occupied by the Soviets, and Poland after it freed itself of the Soviets. Or why not compare Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania to France, Austria, and Greece? Has any one of these 45% of Americans ever considered the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia based upon what socialism did to them?
Well,
The experiment in Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia in socialism caused those countries to be dismembered to the point, what is there, 8, 9 countries that have been carved out of those two? And they were small to begin with.
Yeah.
Has any one of those 45% of Americans who favor socialism asked themselves, why was there an Iron Curtain? If socialism is so damn good, why did the socialists have to imprison their people? Because all their people wanted to do was get to the West. Why would they risk their lives to get to the West if socialism were so damn good? Or you want a more modern example?
They just didn't know how good they had it.
Why did China go from being outside the top 10 nations economically to second place after adopting free enterprise?
Motivation.
When they imposed Maoism and socialism, something around 40 to 50 million Chinese died or were killed. Their economy tanked. No freedom, no opportunity. After all this time, the communist government decides, well, that certainly didn't work. And they decide that economically they're going to allow free enterprise. And look what happened to China. Fastest growing economy, not only in the world, probably in the history of the world. I read today during dinner a number that just floored me. Michael Bloomberg, who's you got to figure, is really, really disappointed that he decided to run for president based upon all of the stupid stuff that's come out of that man's mouth, where he has demeaned everybody on the planet. He's just like Hillary Clinton, a typical hypocrite. Do you know how much he spent in the last 2 months running for the Democratic nomination to oppose Donald Trump? What would you like to guess that he spent in the last 2 months? Now, mind you, he wasn't even involved in those initial primaries. He wasn't involved. He finally had his first debate showing, a couple of maybe a few days ago. So this is really his first time that he's going to be on the ballot. So how much do you think he spent?
50 million, 20 million. I don't know. The ads are very expensive. They're everywhere out here.
Yeah. What's your guess? So he's 20 to 50 million. Is Kirk? What do you think, JB?
Yeah, probably around there. Maybe even close to 100.
How about
not?
How about 400 million?
Are you kidding me?
400 million. Yep.
My gosh.
Yep. The Democratic contenders, one article said that they're spending way more than they're taking in. Elizabeth Warren, for example, took out a $3 million line of credit because she spent more money here in the last month than she took in. Pete Buttigieg has an urgent plea that he needs to raise $1 million a day before Super Tuesday's contest in 14 states. He collected just $6.6 million in January. Bernie Sanders, who's the socialist who happens to own 3 homes and is a millionaire himself. He's part of the 1%.
Very good, comrade.
Yeah, poor Bernie.
You don't hear him bring that up in the news.
Yeah, he raised $25 million in January. Old Joe Biden, by the way, man, he appears to be deader than dead. Now, speaking of politicians, there was a story that came out that has just got to be the most mind-boggling that I have seen in a while. Have you guys heard of Congresswoman Representative Katie Hill? She's a Democrat from Santa Clarita. Ever heard of her?
The name sounds familiar,
Hill.
but I couldn't.
Yeah, she's not far from you, Kirk.
Yeah.
Katie Hill.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. She has claimed that she had to resign Congress because of the rampant biphobia in Congress. Now, I had to look up biphobia.
Yeah,
I don't know.
please.
I thought maybe biphobia was that too many people are wearing bifocals. but no.
What came to my mind?
Now,
okay.
I want to tell you, if you're biphobia in this country today, you got a serious problem because of women between the ages of about 15 and 40. It's probably in the range of 40% of women who are bisexual. Now, that doesn't mean that that they have an equal amount of sexual interest in men and women. It just means that they've had a positive, enjoyable sexual encounter with both a man and a woman, or that they think about having sexual encounters with men and women. And by the way, there's no Torah instruction on women being bisexual. Anyway, so she thinks that she had to resign because of rampant biphobia in Congress. Now, what she didn't bother to say, and it was Stephanopoulos that was interviewing him, and old Steffi, he couldn't spit it out if his life depended on it. I checked into this woman. She resigned because somebody published in I think it was the Daily Mail, pictures of her naked with every Jane, Dick, Harry, and Sally in Washington, D.C. and in California, most of whom had worked for her. She was diddling every member of her staff, men and women. Wow. She's married, and she's on websites where she's saying she and her husband said, "We'd like to have sex with my wife." Now, I don't really care if somebody is sexually active. I don't think God cares either. But one of the things you can't do is you can't do every member of your staff. You can't do any member of your staff. And she was doing every member of her staff. And not only was she doing every member of her staff, she was so proud of it, she had pictures taken of herself and her staff members, both men and women, naked. And in one of these pictures, she's smoking a marijuana pipe. I don't have a problem with marijuana. But if you're going to be in the U.S. Congress, you ought not take a picture of yourself naked smoking marijuana. And, oh, by the way, she has a tattoo. Now, I'm not a fan of tattoos, I have to tell you. So, I've got a little prejudice here. But this woman's tattoo on her bikini line, right next to her hoo-hoo, was a Nazi Iron Cross.
Are you kidding?
No.
Wow.
Nope.
Wow.
Nope.
She resigned because she's just plain stupid.
So she claims that she had to resign because it wasn't her fault. Rampant biphobia. Now, I did pull out some quotes on this because it is pretty darn amazing. Just shocking photographs of the Democrat Katie Hill posing naked with a tattoo of what is a Nazi-era Iron Cross on her bikini line while smoking a bong and making out with her young female aide have been obtained exclusively by the Daily Mail. The congressman, 32, was also pictured naked brushing the young woman's hair, another young woman's hair, who they identify as Morgan Desjardins, who's 24, from Santa Clarita, who also works on her staff. Yeah. And then she had a relationship with Hill and Heslop shortly thereafter, who also worked for her in this time in 2017. They had a three-way affair that broke down this summer when Hill told both them and her husband and her other lovers that she wanted to focus on her work in Congress.
Yeah, I was going to ask, when did she have time to focus? This is the kind of
person that we have making laws that burden the rest of us.
What a Shabbat, huh?
Oh, my God.
What happened to the Shabbats? Oh,
Yep.
where are
Oh,
they
by the way,
now?
I don't know if
We need
you've
those.
seen any of the miniseries on George Washington. George Washington is probably the greatest, the most acclaimed. Let's put this: the most acclaimed general to lose 95% of his battles. I think he won 2 battles. Yeah, he managed to cross the Delaware, and he didn't attack the British, but there were the Hessians, who were German mercenaries, were camped out singing, Christmas songs, allegedly, and he snuck up on them and routed the Hessians, and he then got the French to engage and won the final battle with the French on the other side, and yet he's considered, of course, this first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Well, George Washington, now there's a letter that has been traced back to him, the first president of the United States. Well, he praised the honesty of British farmers, and then he sought to entice British farmers to be tenants on his estates, because American farmers were so slovenly, he wrote, that he didn't want anything to do with them. Now, if you look at George Washington's army, which was like 5,000-6,000 people, and it wasn't even the size of a Roman legion, they were, with the exception of George, who was all pretty, they were in tatters. I mean, some didn't have shoes. So they really didn't have uniforms. They looked slovenly.
Okay.
But to disrespect your own people to that degree, and say that I want British to come and live and grow crops because, well, these Americans, they're just Slavs. I have no respect for them. Looking back at history, do you know that there's 150 historians and researchers who have signed up to access the Vatican archives on Pope Pius XII, which are just now being opened up? He was Hitler's pope. He's a man that had enormous bearing on the rise of Adolf Hitler. And, of course, the Vatican now, after preparing these archives for viewing for the last 10 years, saying the church has nothing to fear from history. Well, the reason that he became pope is because of what he negotiated with Adolf Hitler before the beginning of the war, where he essentially says, I will disband and give you the Catholic political party so long as we can cut a deal. Religiously, their lives belong to me. Politically, their lives belong to you. And I will support whatever you want to do politically, including murder as many Jews as you'd like. I despise them too. Had he not done that, and Hitler acknowledges it. Hitler spent more time bragging about the agreement that he had negotiated with the Roman Catholic Church, with a man that at the time was a cardinal, becoming pope later, than any other agreement he'd ever negotiated. It's the agreement that solidified his power. And one of his last acts was there were 1,000 or so Jews who actually had converted to Roman Catholicism so they wouldn't be tortured and killed in Rome. And at the end of the war, he saw to it they were put on trains and sent to the concentration camps, where all but 4 or 5 died. And the church has nothing to fear from history. Well, the only reason they would have nothing to fear from the history is that to be a Roman Catholic, you have to be either ignorant or irrational, and they're just banking on the fact that Roman Catholics don't give a crap, or that maybe they're equally anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that would be true too.
Anyway, that's a review of the news. I thought that we would begin there just because the times, they are a-changing, and we live in a world where people have been so conditioned to not think, so conditioned to believe, to have been given this mistaken view that opinions are entitlements, and that to be politically correct is right as opposed to wrong, that religions are good when they're bad, that I think every once in a while we just have to expose it, because quite frankly, according to God, the single greatest enemy to humanity is religion. And I think it behooves us to expose it. Now, returning to chapter 4, in Yahowah and then throughout the Greco-Roman world, there would be an abrupt change from Yahweh, the God who gave us life and the means to become immortal, to a new God. This God would ultimately be called Jesus Christ, who is not only mortal, but this God was killed by men. There would be a complete reversal from promoting and affirming Yahweh's Torah, his Mikra and Berith, to denouncing and annulling something called the law, as well as the Jewish feasts, such that the old covenant would be seen as so ineffectual it had to be replaced with a new covenant and requisite New Testament. We'll get to it in a future program, but I didn't know if I should be embarrassed or shout for joy. But my favorite psalm for a long time has been the 19th. And so I just finished yesterday translating the 18th Psalm, which is very long. And the 18th Psalm is essentially about the final battle and Dowd returning with Yahowah and fighting, eliminating really all of the Goyim that have come to oppose Israel. And so I finally turned in the next to translate, looking forward to it, 19th Psalm. Oh my goodness. I missed one thing after another, including the fact that the 19th Psalm is about Dowd, the Gibor, not about Yosha. But one of the things, the reason I'm bringing it up right now, is that the 19th Psalm speaks specifically of how Yahweh's words would be denigrated, and that they would not just be denigrated, they would be called old and be called obsolete, such that they would have to be replaced. Well, that's precisely what Christianity did here. It called the Torah, because of what Paul wrote in Galatians, obsolete, old, out of touch, unable to save. And so they came up with their replacement, New Testament. Well, in the 19th Psalm, the psalm that explains the virtues of the Torah, before we even get to the Torah, God exposes and condemns the foundation of Christianity, which is that the Old Testament would be relegated to the term old, such that a New Testament would replace it. Didn't know it. Little things even that I didn't know. The expansion of the universe that Dowd talks about. Well, he says Dowd actually chose a word that means the universe expansion is going to be flat. We didn't know until a matter of a handful of years ago that the universe is actually flat. Well, God obviously knew it 3,000 years ago. And there's just one thing after another, and you just read this, you say, boy, how did I miss that? Well, anyway, I think what I finally decided that I'm not going to beat myself up over it, because if any of us were a know-it-all, then our existence would be miserable. If you were a know-it-all, what would you do with the rest of your life?
Now, what would be the fun of going back and re-looking at that verse if you already learned everything you could from it? Or
Right,
not verse, but
right.
Psalm.
Right.
I read it once.
What
I'm
would
good.
I do?
I'm done.
Yeah. What would I do tomorrow if I was a know-it-all today? What would we do in eternity if we begin eternity knowing it all?
Yeah.
I would
Learning
think
is
that would
fun.
be the worst thing that you could ever happen is to be a know-it-all. So, I'm glad that God has patience. I'm glad he has a sense of humor.
We're all in luck.
And, and so I said, there's a direct correlation between ignorance and insights. You couldn't have insights if you weren't previously ignorant,
yeah.
right?
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So anyway, as we turn the page from Yahweh's divinely inspired and consistently accurate prophets, away from men like Yeshayah, Yirmiah, Zechariah at the end of his book, and open up a new one beginning with the Gospel of Matthew. Everything of the past, Yahweh's love for his people, Yisrael and Yehuda, even his dire warnings about the ways of the Gentiles are completely upended. And God ends up hating his people and choosing the dreaded Gentiles over them. It is literally a complete reversal. How in the world could you tack on this addendum to the end of a book that you said is inspired by God, and everything you have to say at the end of the book is a complete and utter reversal of what was said before it, which you said was inspired by God and completely accurate. And yet you're contradicting every bit. You're not just contradicting it. You're taking the chosen people whom Yah loved, and you're saying, no, those are now the hated people who we need to kill. You're taking all of the marvelous promises that God made to Dowd and says, no, they don't apply to him. Now, every time that God mentioned David's name, he really meant to say Jesus. And every time he made promises to those Israelis, he really meant to say church and Christians. Well, maybe just once you'd expect him to actually say church, Christians, and Jesus, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you would think so.
Never once.
Maybe once or twice.
Evidently, the God of Christianity is so stupid. He doesn't know the difference between Dowd's name and Yosha's, David or Jesus. He doesn't know the difference between Israel and the Christian church. I don't know. Maybe. But the God that I'm reading, his testimony and we've read in the Torah, Prophet, Psalms, seems really smart to me. And, I'm constantly, we have a covenant member that constantly sends interesting articles of things that have been found. And you speak of getting your names right. Yahweh would mention, like this was a Canaanite town. And he said in this Canaanite town, they were famous for ABC. Well, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, guess what? We found the Canaanite town. And guess what? It had exactly what Yahweh said. It existed exactly what he said it existed. It was named what he said it was named. Everything he says about the past, every name that he uses, even to the point of when he's talking about the dreaded Egyptians, he actually transliterates the title Pharaoh. He actually transliterates the name Ramses. Long before we actually knew how to pronounce those things, because we didn't learn how to pronounce them and read the hieroglyphics until the Rosetta Stone.
Correct.
Yeah. God's really good. He got all of the names of the Babylonians and the Assyrians. He got them all right. Long before we knew they were accurate. He even talked about the Hittites, who he calls the Hittites at a time when every archaeologist said, well, it proves the Bible's wrong because there were no Hittites.
I've heard that.
So what do you think the odds are that the God that got every detail of every country, place, kingdom, people, and ruler, and every one of their cities right, couldn't get church, Christian, Jesus
yeah.
right?
Why doesn't that strike people in their core? I mean, what is it? That's just
cognitive
phenomenal.
dissonance, I guess. Why would you take the brilliant writing of Dowd? And Dowd writes beautifully. I mean,
oh yeah.
Dude can strike a line, man. I mean, he, even when we dumb it down into English, he's
still
brilliant.
Comes out brilliant.
And he gets the past right, he gets the future right, and he understands the very mind of God. And why would you reject what Dowd had to say, and then you embrace Paul, who's not writing in Hebrew, but writing in Greek, and his Greek stinks. I mean, if you actually look at a Bible that is honest about what's there, what you'll find is that it's filled with these words in italics, which are supplied words because the sentence isn't a sentence and makes no sense without them, and yet they aren't in the original text. Why would anyone believe a man who contradicted himself and contradicts God and constantly misquotes God over a guy that God himself inspired?
Makes no sense.
God didn't say that Jesus was the Messiah.
No, never
Jesus
did.
didn't claim to be the Messiah.
No,
Jesus claimed to be the Son of Man, not the Son of God. And you've got a guy that Yahweh says, he's the Messiah. You've got a guy that Yahweh says, he's my son, I'm his father. You've got a guy that Yahweh says, he's coming back with me. I'm going to raise him so that he comes back with me when I return for my people. And that guy is always Dowd and never Jesus. And yet, have you ever heard anybody talk about the second coming of Dowd?
Only here.
How many people refer to Dowd as the King of Kings?
We do.
How many people call Dowd the Messiah?
Once again.
And he's all of those things. If you say, I want to speak to you about the Son of God, how many people are going to say, well, he wants to talk about Dowd, I want to listen to this? No, they don't. And yet, that's what God says.
Yeah, over and over.
Over and over again. After being regaled with countless long, credible, enlightening narratives, which are verifiable in the annals of history and archaeology, about the likes of Noah. You want to see Noah's Ark? Google Earth. There's a whole compound now around it. You can see it. Yeah, deal with the fact that Yahweh says that the flood in this region is going to start with an upwelling of deep seawater, and then study what happened after the Burkle crater impact, the timing of the Burkle crater impact, and how that tsunami of seawater after the asteroid strike went all the way up through the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, inundated the area that he was specifically interested in, which was around the Black Sea, rose the average height of the water there by 500 feet, turned a freshwater lake into salt water at that instant, and then pushed out through the Bosphorus Straits. Go check what he actually wrote. Go even look at the dimensions of the ark and how it was perfectly designed, unlike anything at the time, including being made with glue lamps. And you compare that with the drivel that Paul wrote. We spent a number of shows going over Paul's first speech, Acts 13. Man didn't say anything is true. Oh, I can't say didn't say anything is true.
Got to have a glimmer.
Because you always have to have a glimmer. Yeah, and in fact, it's not a good lie unless you're twisting the truth to make your lie. Makes it far worse than if you lied about everything. But there wasn't a single sentence that didn't contain things that were easily proven to be untrue. So after the verifiable stories of Noah, of Abraham, of Moshe, and Dowd, the things we learned, the things Yahweh accomplished through these men, they're all turned to mush with nothing but an occasional and unattested musing about them, which actually upends their lives in an irrational attempt to negate everything they represented and to validate an entirely different narrative. From one page to the next, from Malachi to Matthew, everything changes. At least after the Sermon on the Mount. It's all reversed. In the Hebrew text, a relationship was prized above all else, and religion was despised. And then suddenly, that relationship was discarded and replaced with a religion. Why? What's the purpose of the beginning of the book when the addendum works so hard to usurp its credibility and then negate it? Think of that. Works so hard to usurp its credibility and then negate it. Well,
to what end?
They have a word for that.
What?
It's called stupid.
Yeah.
You can't claim that this provides the credibility for my religion and then say, oh, by the way, what it says is untrue. We had to replace it because, well, we're contradicting all of it. That is to say, all of that old stuff was unreliable and ineffective and no longer applies no matter what God said about it. But nonetheless, you should still trust us because that same God who got everything wrong in the past authorized us to denounce him and come up with an entirely different plan. Say what?
No joke.
We turn, It's breathtaking. It's maddening. It's frustrating. And, of course, we're considered hateful for exposing and condemning the idiocy of religion, and particularly Christianity. And yet, I don't think there's anything we can do that's more compassionate. I met a fellow day before yesterday. His boat's just 2 from mine. And he's a senior executive of GoDaddy. And he was talking about all of the initiatives that are being placed on internet providers and hosting providers, such as GoDaddy, to eliminate hate. And so we had this whole conversation about how utterly wrong-minded that was.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Yeah, and I said, for example, I have a book that starts Hate's a Virtue. We need to understand that you can't love unless you despise. And that there are things that we need to despise, and we need to know how to despise them. You don't despise them with bullets and bombs and fists and knives. You despise them with words wielded wisely. But you need to expose and condemn institutions that encourage heinous behavior.
Yeah.
The Roman Catholic Church,
it's directed properly.
Yeah. You have to understand what it is appropriate to hate. Yeah, a lot of people know. Well, pedophiles and pedophilia, it's appropriate to hate. Rape and rapists, yeah, that's probably a good thing to hate.
Mass murder.
Mass murder, yeah, good thing to hate.
Yeah.
Terrorists, oh, yeah, probably a good thing to hate. You know, sex slavery.
On and on and on.
Probably a good thing to hate. But how do you hate it? Do you hate it by sending your military out and breaking a country like we did with Syria?
Or do
you hate it by exposing and condemning the religion that inspired it? We don't seem to be able to get that. Because if you expose and condemn the religion that expired it, you're the one that's considered hateful, not the sex traders and mass murderers. When in fact, if they would listen to what you had to say, there'd be a lot less of those heinous acts.
That's just stunning.
We turn to Shaul, Paul's original diatribe, and his New Testament to see if Yahweh was right when he denounced the son of evil for renouncing him, and then transferring every promise he made to his beloved son, Dowd, to a character who bears no resemblance to him, now called Jesus Christ. And while we affirmed his assertion, we also came to see why God loathes the despised and despicable soul who changed his name from Shaul to Paul, along with his allegiance from Israel to Greece and Rome. Now, Kirk, you told me that there's some confusion over that, the preamble to Acts 13, where Paul has labels a fellow named Yosha as a false prophet.
Yes.
Now, that's a real problem because Yosha happens to be the actual name of the Jesus that he claims that he is representing. And it means Yahweh saves. And then the next thing out of Paul's mouth was that the name Jesus is properly translated Elemos. Well, no. Yosha is translated Yahweh saves. That is all it means. Well, you could say Yahweh liberates, Yahweh delivers, Yahweh saves, Yahweh rescues. That's what Yosha is. It's from Yahweh and Yasha. Yasha means to liberate, free, deliver, save, rescue. Yeah, free. That's what Yasha means. Elemos means my God rejects.
That's rich.
First of all, Paul is an ignoramus, and that Elemos is not a translation of Yosha. And Christians are ignoramuses because you try to read what they write about this, and every one of them's got to know Elemos is not a translation of Yosha, not a translation even of Jesus. Jesus isn't a translation of Yosha, and they know that they've got a real problem. And so they just put their heads in the sand. So Paul was probably right. But Elemos means my God rejects. Well, what is my God rejecting? Well, the last name was Yosha. So the God that Paul is representing rejects Yosha. Last time I checked, Yahweh was saving us through Yosha. To reject Yosha means you can kiss your sorry ass goodbye because there's no Pesach.
That's right.
No Pesach, no life. No life. No eternity in heaven. My guess is that God doesn't reject Yosha, but Paul's God did, and Paul begins his career. This is his first big speaking part. His first speech. Before he even begins his first speech, he says, my God rejects Yosha. That's his translation of Yosha. My God rejects. And Christians, you can't figure it out? Well, we have demonstrated with very little effort that Shaul, now Paul, deliberately misquoted and misrepresented the Torah and prophets to promote his new religion. We also discovered that he lied about what occurred in and what would soon be called Hadrianopolis. He presented Jews as his enemy and the enemy of his God, even as the people who murdered his God. The Gentiles were suddenly in the role of Jews, and Jews were acting like Gentiles. As a result, we are told that Paul's God changed his allegiances. Yeah, gonna switch teams now. And that became the foundation of the new religion, replacing the Christian church for Jews. This leads us to wonder what came first, the hideous anti-Semitic episode at the conclusion of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jews are engaged in elaborate conspiracies to kill Jesus, or Paul's crusade against them. Are we to believe that Paul was justified in his accusation that God had come to hate his people for killing his son to such a degree that he suddenly changed loyalties? Or do we believe that God was now embracing the Roman beast, which is shown cleansing its hands of the whole bloody affair, as the story is told in Matthew 27? Well, let me ask you a question. I've spent a lot of time here translating the end times prophecies. Dowd has a lot to say about them. You know, the first 19 Psalms are a lot of them. The core story of those first 19 Psalms is about Dowd's return, Yahweh's return, the return and restoration of Yisrael and Yehudah. And I've translated the prophets, what Yirmiah had to say about the return and restoration of Yehudim and Yisrael. Why is it in all of the prophecies, and this is the number one prophetic story in the entirety of the prophets, even in the Torah, it's the most reoccurring prophecy. Why is the most reoccurring prophecy Yahweh returning for his people returning to Yisrael, and his relationship with Yisrael and Yehudah being restored? Why is that the number one most commonly repeated prophecy if God has abandoned his people, is going to condemn them, has no interest in restoring his relationship with them, and is in fact returning for Gentiles now called Christians?
The question is,
you
why?
Want to tell me that God lied all those times?
Yeah, absolutely not.
The Christian is full of lies.
Yeah.
But that's what you'd have to believe, and that all of these prophecies, one after another. In fact, the only prophecy that actually hints at the existence of a New Testament is devoted to Yahweh returning on behalf of Yisrael and Yehudah, not a Christian church. And even then, it's a reaffirmation of the covenant, not a new covenant. And even then, there is one difference between the covenant as it exists today and the covenant as it will exist upon his return. It's not replacing the Torah. It's the complete integration of the Torah within our life. Yahweh's going to write a copy of his Torah right inside of us. How can you read that, Christians, and not recognize that every aspect of your religion is rubbish? That you have been duped to believe a lie. All of it. There is no Jesus. There is no Christ. There is no church. There is no such thing as a Christian. There is no Trinity other than in the myth of religion.
Well, that's why, what did you always say? They read questioning Paul. If you can get through it, you're no longer a Christian. It's impossible, unless you're just totally brain dead.
Yeah.
I mean,
you have to be.
Your brain goes, wow.
There's a reason they call it faith and that they're a belief system, because you can't get there on evidence and reason.
Yeah. I just don't want to believe that.
In fact, you go exactly the opposite direction on evidence and reason. We're not trying to make fun of the religion of 2.5 billion people. We're trying to get you to wake up so that you don't squander your soul to all of these lies that have been promoted in a book called A New Testament, whose principal author, God himself called the plague of death, the son of evil and the father of lies. In the current order of things, the Gospel of Matthew precedes the Acts of the Apostles in addition to Paul's 14 letters. It has the appearance that Paul's animosity flowed naturally from what was alleged to have been said before or during the trial before Pilate. While he was a liar of the first order, could Paul have been justified in concluding that God had turned on his people, as the Gospel of Matthew suggests? As is the case with most things worth knowing, if we want to know the truth, we have to invest considerable time and due diligence to assess the credibility of the gospel attributed to Matthew. It, my friends, is the last thing I wanted to do. It's the last thing I wanted to do because the Sermon on the Mount is so pure, so effective. And I happen to like the Olivet Discourse too. And both the Sermon on the Mount and the Olivet Discourse destroy Christianity, reaffirm the Torah, reaffirm the prophets. They are so profoundly true that when you get them out of the muck of Greek and you return them to the words that were actually spoken in Hebrew and convey them as accurately as we can, they resonate. They tell us so much. And the last thing I wanted to do was to besmirch the credibility of that book, which is really the only eyewitness other than Yahowah. And Yahowah says very, very little about Yosha during the 3 years of his witness. And we have so little of what Yosha actually said, none of what he said in Hebrew, and so little of what he said overall, that I really wanted Matthew to be credible. And I've quoted it in terms of the Sermon on the Mount in particular and the Olivet Discourse as credible. And I still think those statements are credible. But here was my problem. The problem was that I realized that according to Paul, God turned on the Jews. He went from those being the chosen people whom he loved, whom he was going to return for, who was going to bring back to his land, and whom he was going to restore his relationship with. And that according to Paul, he decided that, no, I'm going to hate them instead. I want to replace them with Gentiles because I despise them. And the most anti-Semitic diatribes are actually at the conclusion of the book of Matthew. So what are you going to do with that? Are you just going to ignore it because it doesn't, you don't want to have to deal with it?
Okay.
So after having translated Paul's replacement of, I'm going to replace you Jews with Gentiles because you Jews don't deserve salvation because you Jews killed God. It's either he was right because that's what it says in the Gospel of Matthew, or he influenced the Gospel of Matthew, which is why it says that. One of the two. And I've spent the last 18 years, you guys, many of those years together with me, almost 19 now, translating the Torah, prophets, and Psalms. Come to know Yahweh pretty well.
I think so.
Yahweh doesn't change. He made a promise to Abraham. He's going to honor the promise to Abraham. He's really clear as to what he is going to do, who his people are, how he's going to return for his people, and how he's going to restore his relationship with the people. It's really clear. And so it's obvious that the story in Matthew of God turning on his people and replacing them with Gentiles, the story that Paul told of the same thing, are obviously in conflict with what God himself says. I got a choice between believing what a man allegedly named Matthew wrote, what Paul wrote, or what God inspired and proved through prophecy. I'm going to go with God. I like him. I like him. He's credible.
For my sake.
Yeah, we're buds. So I'm going to go with God. So now what am I going to do with Matthew?
Throw it away.
If my suspicions are correct, and they are based entirely upon what we've come to know about Yahweh, in addition to what he has promised Dowd, I think that we'll find that while portions of it were correctly rendered very early on in Hebrew, after the Sermon on the Mount, very little of what follows in the Gospel of Matthew was actually written by the disciple, a tax collector, whose actual name was Levi. Do you know that the disciple is named in both Mark and Luke? His name was Levi. And so the only place where there is a disciple named Matthew is in the book of Matthew. And that the actual tax collector wasn't Matthew at all. It was Lowy. He was the Levite. Now that's a real problem. Now, if you read it and you try to read a Christian site to explain why the book of Matthew says that it was Matthew, and the book of Mark and Luke, of which 66% of Matthew is derived, say no, his name was Levi. What they'll say is that, one's his Greek name and the other one was his Hebrew name. I'm sorry, but Matthew happens to be a Hebrew name.
That doesn't work.
Yeah, Matthew happens to be a Hebrew name. It means Matt and Yah. So I'm sorry, but they're both Hebrew names, and they're very different Hebrew names. One means gift of Yah, the other one means to unite.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, Elohi could not have been a tax collector, and so I don't get it.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is a very serious problem relative to the identity of the book's namesake. Matthew 9:9 says, "And Jesus passed on from there, and he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax office, and he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he rose and followed him." That's Matthew 9:9. Whereas Mark, from which the Gospel of Matthew was plagiarized, reads, "And he passed by. He saw Levi," which is Lowy in Hebrew, "the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax office. And he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he rose and followed him." Mark 2:14. How can your Bible be the inerrant word of God when you read this conflict about the alleged author of the first book of your New Testament?
You just got to believe.
The Gospel of Luke, from which substantial portions of Matthew were derived, conveys a similar account in Luke 5:27. "And after that he went out, and he noticed a tax collector named Levi sitting in the tax office. And he said to him, 'Follow me.'" As such, prudence dictates that there never was a disciple named Mattaniah Matthew, and that the book bearing his name was written by an impostor. Now, Christians will protest, of course, and say almost anything to avoid the realization that this is any realization that's caustic to their beliefs. The first Christian resource I checked on this matter wrote, "The answer is very simple. Both are true because Matthew and Levi are the same person. Matthew is the Greek name and Levi was the Hebrew name. As a tax collector, Matthew worked for the Greek-speaking Romans. Taxes from Hebrews speaking Jews. We see as an example Peter also being called Simon. Oh, you idiot. The Romans didn't speak Greek. They spoke Latin.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew and Levi are both Hebrew names. Simon is Shimon. It's Hebrew. Peter is not his name. It's completely made up. Peter is called Peter because rock is Petros in Greek. The name, the disciple's name was, is, and always will be Shimon from Shamar. Listen. Should you believe the diatribe where he is called a rock, you'll find it that the term that is used, Kephesh, is a Hebrew word. Kephesh is not Peter. Every aspect of what this Christian wrote is simply untrue. Kephesh, by the way, is from Keph, which is related to kafar. It's the basis of reconciliation. And indeed, this is the very purpose of the Mikre of which Yosha was speaking when the title was offered to the disciple. The truth is so vastly superior to the lies, it's a wonder Christians prefer lies to the truth. As is the case with all but some unknown portion of two books within the entirety of the Christian New Testament, Yahuwah, John, and his revelation. The closer we look, the worse it gets. We're about to discover that Paul's diatribes were scribed and distributed long before the Greek version of Matthew was penned, and that it was Paul's attitude towards Jews that would cause the gospel to read as it does today. Since this assessment is consistent with the historical evidence, Christianity is a house of cards, all kings, queens, and jokers, and it's about to tumble to the ground. Guys, you've read this. I think it's the most explosive expose we've yet undertaken.
It's amazing, yes.
So we'll be clear.
Boy.
While there is no independent historical affirmation, it would still be reasonable to conclude that Yosha was condemned to be crucified by the Roman governor Pilate in the province of Yehuda, Judea, on Passover, Pesach, in 33 CE. It is also possible, but not assured by any means, that some of Yehuda's religious leaders, including the high priest, were opposed to Yosha because he didn't respect them. The preponderance of the Jewish people, however, didn't know or care one way or the other, in contrast to what was written. It is likely that the few who met the reclusive Yosha along the way would have been impressed with what he had to say. Just to say the word reclusive Yosha, I'm sure, is anathema to Christians.
I was thinking that. Yeah.
But he was.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
I mean, every time you see him where
him.
he's engaged with people, he is annoyed by them. He speaks down to them. And as soon as he can slip away and to get away as a recluse, he's gone. You see, Yosha didn't come here
to proselytize,
to provide us with with instructions. That's why not a single word that he spoke is recorded in the language he spoke it in. That's why there's no accurate accounting of anything he said. He didn't come here to do as Dowd had done, which is to provide us with copious amounts of information so that we would be able to understand the Torah and the prophets, understand who Yahweh is, what he's offering and expecting in return. That wasn't his role. And so he had no interest in telling us any of that. Disciples who were like the previous prophets, who could instantly write down everything he said. If you read Yirmiyah, you read Yeshaya, what's the first thing you read? Yahweh says, write this down. Get a scroll. Write down everything I say. Is there a single mention of Yosha saying, hey, I got 12 of you. One of you has got to be literate around here. Hey, write this stuff down.
Here?
But the Torah was complete. It has everything.
Right, everything.
He said it
he
was,
didn't come
and lacking nothing.
To tickle our ears.
No.
He didn't want to be bothered with the people because he didn't come to communicate to the people. He didn't come to be worshipped by the people. He didn't come to start a new religion. He came to be the Pesach Lamb. That's it. There is no instruction in the Torah for the Pesach Lamb to walk into the home and jibber-jabber with the people. There's for sure no instruction on the Passover Lamb coming back to life. It's for darn sure the Passover Lamb's not God. And so we just have a complete brain-dead gap here between the faith and reality. So Yosha came to be the Passover Lamb. He was a recluse. He did not want to engage with the people. He wasn't here to talk to us. He was here to serve as the Pesach Lamb. Further, as for those who may not have respected him, the Jewish leaders were neither teachers of the law, as they are errantly portrayed, nor any more depraved in character, nor anti-God, than any clerics or politicians, most notably Christians. If God had shown up at the Vatican, he would have been treated far worse. Catholics would have used the grotesque implements of torture they had invented for their Inquisition to elicit a confession from that Jew. Some of what we read today in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and especially in Yahowah and John, pertaining to the events of Passover in 33 CE, appear to be accurate. However, there are as many differences between their stories as there are similarities, which is an affront to their credibility. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not the reports of eyewitnesses nor of prophets, and thus they were not inspired by God, nor were they inerrant in the manner of the Hebrew text of the Torah Wanabi. Much of what was reported is inconsistent with the history of that time and with common sense. There was only one eyewitness, Yahowah, who claims personal knowledge of these events and discussions. But even he was not a witness to the musings of the Jewish religious leaders or what was said before Pilate or Herod. And his assessment has been subject to more religious tampering than any other, such that it is now impossible to distinguish what may have been said from what a religious scribe in Egypt or a cleric in Caesarea attributed to him. Now, I said that Yahowah was the only eyewitness. That's not true. And I don't want to leave you with something that can be interpreted incorrectly. There was one eyewitness that saw everything that occurred on Pesach, Matzah, and Bikurim, and told us in great detail, specifically how Yosha would serve as the Pesach lamb, describing, and even in medical terms, with precise historical accuracy, such that Yosha himself would quote this source. It's Dowd, David. 1,000 years before the events occurred, he was brought forward in time and wrote in great detail about the fulfillment of Pesach, Matzah, and Bikurim. So there was an eyewitness, the ultimate eyewitness, God's Son, the real Messiah. He was there. Evidence and reason dictate that there are limited portions of what is contained in the Gospel of Matthew that were written by an eyewitness not bearing that name. However, the overwhelming preponderance of the events regaled in the Greek text, especially in Matthew, were written by an impostor, someone that will become evident momentarily. And Paul's accomplice, Luke, Paul refers to Luke as his fellow worker in Philemon, who offers lots of love. He was no better. They were both anti-Torah and overtly anti-Semitic, which is likely why the Gospel of Matthew reads as it does today. Now, I'll admit, I'm biased. I'm with Yahowah. I trust him. I've come to love God's people and despise those who abuse him. I appreciate those who tell the truth and abhor those who deliberately deceive. Call me biased. So before we press on, I have a confession to make on a directly related topic. I'm saying this a lot these days. I was wrong, specifically about Matt and Yah. The evidence is clear. Nary a word was written by a disciple named Matthew. The former tax collector turned disciple Levi, did, however, unintentionally contribute to it with his book called According to Hebrew. Unfortunately, as little as 10% of what is presently contained in the Greek text came from According to Hebrew. The rest was largely hearsay and plagiarized, and then embellished under the influence of the despised and despicable one. This conclusion is readily derived from the text itself because the Gospel of Matthew is exceedingly anti-Semitic. Well, I've come to this conclusion reluctantly. It was driven by trying to understand the origins of the anti-Jewish nature of the episode before Pontius Pilate, and really the zombie-esque conclusion of Matthew 27, especially as it relates to Paul's rant against Jews in Acts 13. It is the case of the wolf and his litter. Now let's acknowledge and become grounded in what is factual. And before I say that, we'll go on just a little bit longer, fellas. If it's all right with you, we're not broadcasting anymore. We are still recording, but 95% listen on sites like yours, JB, to the archives and not the not just the live broadcast. And a lot of people are call in and they listen on the phone, and those who are listening on the phone are still able to hear what we're saying at this point. The Gospel of Matthew does not specify an author. It would not have been the case if it had been written by one of Yosha's disciples, because the realization that he was both chosen by Yosha and an eyewitness would have given his account enormous credibility. as is the case with Yahowah and John. Moreover, had it been scribed by a disciple, it would have been called Loe Levi. It is only called Matthew because the tax collector's name was changed and misappropriated. The resulting Gospel of Matthew was based on Mark. Now, we've all heard this before, but I just want you to deal with this reality.
Yeah.
600 of Mark's 661 verses are incorporated into the book of Matthew. Let me say that again. 600 of Mark's 661 verses are incorporated into the text of Matthew. Taking far less than 90% of any text and passing it off as one's own is dismissed and discredited as plagiarism today. And yet, that's what the book of Matthew is all about. 600 of Mark's 661 statements are incorporated in the book of Matthew. There are an additional 220 statements taken from Luke, Paul's co-worker. By the way, Paul specifically mentions a Mark. There is every reason to believe that Mark was also part of Paul's posse. In truth, 56% of the Greek text of Matthew came from Mark, and 24% was lifted from Paul's associate Luke, such that only 20% of it is original. Half of that jaundiced by Shaul himself. Each time the Torah and prophets are cited, the wording matches that found in the Septuagint, including that of the supposed virgin birth. Every time Yisrael and Yehudim are mentioned, text reflects the attitude we find reflected in Paul's oral and written diatribes against them. Now that we know where the content was taken from, let's consider the timing of events. Since it is contained his defiant and emotionally charged rebuttal to the excruciating trial before Yosha's disciples in Jerusalem, and since it is the only letter to restate, actually contradict, his frightening encounter with the flashing light he claimed was Jesus, Paul's first letter was the one he dashed off to rebuke the Galatians. It was penned in 52 CE. Over the next decade, his other 13 epistles would be written and widely distributed. They are preserved in their entirety in P46, parchment 46, papyrus 46, actually. A scribal copy comprising the most comprehensive early papyrus. Luke, Paul's beloved physician, read the conclusion of Colossians if you want to know who he is, was a very active player in Paul's entourage and produced the book that bears his name in addition to Acts of the Apostles, composing both towards the end of Paul's life at around 66 years of age in 66 CE. Considering that Paul admits that the thorn in his side was a messenger from Satan, Dr. Luke may have been a frustrated exorcist. The overwhelming majority of the scholars have concluded that the earliest Greek edition of the Gospel of Matthew was written between 80 and 90 CE, after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple by Rome in 70 CE. That is at least 2 decades after Luke wrote his Gospel and Acts, and the circulation of Galatians and the dissemination of Paul's other epistles. Its gestation, therefore, coincided with the end of the Torah-centric movement among Yahudim, Jews who followed Yosha, and the subsequent transition to the overwhelmingly Gentile phenomenon that evolved into the Christian religion. The author of the text may have been Jewish, but if so, he had become decidedly Christian. He wrote in a highly polished version of Greek. His story reads like a journey from one to the other, going from the Torah-affirming Sermon on the Mount to the Romanesque nature of the meeting before Pilate and subsequent Roman crucifixion before a mob of angry Jews. Interesting in this regard, prior to the melee leading to the crucifixion, Yehudim are called Yisraelites by the compiler, only becoming Ayudai, Jews, thereafter as a sign of their rejection of the Christian Christ. This is shown precluding them from the kingdom of heaven, as evidence that the promises made to them had been taken away and given instead to the church. In fact, the only support for this kind of replacement theology among the Gospels, and apart from Paul's letters and the book of Acts, is found in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, in my defense, I had a good reason for considering key aspects of what I had wrongly attributed to Matthew favorably. I wasn't alone. There is sound justification to conclude that Yosha told the disciple Levi about his encounter with Yahuchanan in the Jordan and with Satan in the wilderness, such that these stories about his encounter were incorporated into the Gospel's 3rd and 4th chapters. And there is every reason to conclude that as an eyewitness to the Sermon on the Mount, the disciple Levi transcribed what he heard, composing what is now found in the 5th to 7th chapters. The reason that this rings true is because there is credible extant evidence showing that the earliest followers of Yosha were Torah-observant Yehudim who read what Levi wrote in a book called According to Hebrew, and they read nothing else apart from the Torah and prophets. Affirming this, in 140 CE, Papias wrote that the book his fellow Christians referred to as Matthew has compiled the sayings of Jesus in Hebrew. In addition, Irenaeus wrote, they use Matthew only, and they repudiate the Apostle Paul, maintaining that he was an apostate from the Torah. If Irenaeus is right, we already have our answer. The Talmud even admits to burning early Hebrew accounts pertaining to Yosha's testimony. The lone account would have been Levi's according to Hebrew, now mislabeled the Gospel of Matthew. Even Jerome, the author of the Vulgate, admits to receiving a truncated copy of this book, written in Hebrew, one which he said was prepared for him by a Jewish acquaintance near Antioch. Fragmentary evidence of it is preserved in his notes, known simply as According to Hebrew, or just Hebrew. It was attributed to the disciple and contained the prophetic testimony leading to Yosha's birth, while excluding the genealogy now found in the Gospel of Matthew, which, by the way, is errant. The Hebrew text chronicled Yosha's experience in the Jordan River and his temptation before Satan in the wilderness. It included a limited collection of Yosha's most important sayings, specifically his Sermon on the Mount, which is found nowhere else in the Christian New Testament. Hebrew addressed Yahushua's transfiguration, along with his celebration of Pesach with his disciples before actually fulfilling Passover. It even covered Yahushua's first appearance thereafter, which was to his brother, Jacob. Who is Yahweh returning for?
Jacob, Israel.
You betcha. Yep. Jacob and Yisrael are synonymous.
Mm-hmm.
The book of According to Hebrew states that while the set-apart spirit was responsible for Yahushua's birth, Yahushua was a man, not God. Although later in life, that is, if we can trust Jerome's citation of According to Hebrews, in his commentary on Isaiah 4, Loe, who was not yet an eyewitness, is said to have written, "And it came to pass when Yahushua came up out of the water, the whole font of the set-apart spirit descended upon him and rested upon him, and said to him, My son, in all of the prophets was I waiting for you, so that you might come and I rest upon you." While Jerome didn't mention it in deference to Mary, according to the citations of others, the set-apart spirit was called Mother, and she was noted for her wise counsel throughout the book of Hebrew. Based upon what was quoted in According to Hebrew, it's worth reiterating that this eyewitness account concludes with Yahushua's first post-Bikurim appearance, which, as we have mentioned, was with his brother and disciple Jacob, affirming that he made this sacrifice for his people, Yisrael. And speaking of Jacob, in Jerome's commentary on Ezekiel 6, in reference to Hebrew, he would lament on behalf of the Roman Catholic insistence that Mary remained a virgin. There is counted among the most grievous offenses. He said, "He that has grieved the spirit of his brother," is the citation from Hebrews. As why we might expect, Hebrew presents Jacob, Yehuda, and Yisrael as brothers and the Torah favorably. But it specifically says that Jacob was Yahushua's brother. And of course, Jerome had a conniption fit, because in Roman Catholicism, Mary has to stay a perpetual virgin. So she could not have given birth to Jacob. Affirming the existence of the Hebrew eyewitness account, Clement, Origen, others, Didymus, all cite from it, as did Jerome. They admit that According to Hebrew was used as a proof text to supplement what is now called the Gospel of Matthew. Eusebius, the most villainous man in this entire episode, included a reference to it in his list of disputed writings, Anti-Legomena, noting that it was only used by the Hebrews, sadly, shamefully, as a result of Eusebius and Roman Catholicism. Indeed, because of their utter disdain for all things Jewish, the codices of Hebrew were obliterated when the church canon was codified in the 4th century. According to Hebrew was demeaned as heretical and destroyed. That is with the exception of its memory. Even the Roman Catholic Church admits Christian antiquity is unanimous in maintaining that St. Matthew wrote a gospel in Hebrew. The testimony of St. Papias, St. Irenaeus, St. Pantheus, Origen, Eusebius, St. Ephesius, Saint Jerome, and many of the fathers and ecclesiastical writers bear out this statement. You can check that if you're into such things at eCatholic 2000. Catholics online for the Third Reich. Oops, my mistake. Or the third millennium.
No.
You know, it's just thinking though. Third Reich.
You got to have a little.
What in the hell was the Third Reich? Does anybody know what the Third Reich was?
It was
what was the first
reign.
Reich? What was the first Reich? You're a historian. What was the first Reich?
Rome.
Yeah, Imperial Rome. What was the second Reich?
Roman Catholic Church, I guess.
The Holy Roman Empire.
The Holy Roman Empire.
Imperial Rome, the first Reich. The Holy Roman Empire, the second Reich. And Hitler's rise of Nazi Germany, that was the Third Reich. That was an ode to Pope Pius. Well, with my poor attempt at humor here, maybe it's a good place. Dalen wanting to get her daddy's attention in the background anyway, and probably a good stopping place. We'll pick it up here. And you know, for those that just want to hear statements translated out of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew, and us to say this is something profound and derive the insights from it, we're going to be away from that for a little bit. I think this is something we have to do.
Yeah,
it is. I had no idea until we started translating the first 20 Psalms, guys, that all of Dowd's enemies, as he keeps on talking about his enemies, those enemies didn't exist 3,000 years ago.
No.
His enemy is the man who stole everything that God promised him and gave to a fictitious man God, so that man God would have credibility. His enemy is principally Shaul, but not the king, the wannabe apostle, the self-proclaimed apostle Shaul. Dowd's enemy is the Christian church. I had no idea that was the case, but it's clear, it's blatant, it's irrefutable.
Irrefutable.
And so what you've got to do now is to figure out how Paul was able to influence Romans and Greeks such that Romans and Greeks believed that everything Yahweh said, a God they don't even know, their God said about David was actually pertains to their Jesus. And every promise he made to Yisrael applied to Christians. And every statement in favor of Yahudim, Jews, was for their church. How did all of that happen?
You don't let
Why
them read the
is
Torah.
the Christian New Testament so anti-Semitic? Why are Paul's letters so anti-Semitic? Why are Jews accused of things that no Jew has ever done? You've got not only 2.5 billion people that are lost in the myth of Christianity. It's far worse than that. Because the Roman Catholic Church, with Paul as its root, are principally responsible for the blame the Jews conspiracies that are haunting God's people today, and for the religion that is most responsible for their degradation and annihilation. And so, to free Yahweh's chosen people from this horrible religion and the influence it's had on humankind and on human society, we have to expose it and condemn it. Whether we're doing so in hopes that a few Christians will wake up and smell the truth, or it's just that
possibly
finally Jews, who particularly secular Jews, will understand, how this has happened to them and why they must walk away from the societies that have been so influenced.
Yeah.
So, excuse me while we go into this, but I think we have to do it.
Yeah. Did Paul always intentionally, I know Satan would, but was Paul always ready to do that, or was he just beat up so bad by the apostles in that meeting in Jerusalem that he just got out of town and licked his wounds and turned on them horribly?
No.
He was always that way.
No. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No,
well, it'd have to be if he's.
He was there are a lot of self-loathing people within various races, but he was a self-loathing Jew. Muhammad was a self-loathing Jew. Hitler was a self-loathing Jew. A lot of them. God's really clear. The Jews have been their own worst enemy for a long time, and Paul was just happened to be the worst of the worst. But no, he, by his own admission, Paul was vicious. He refers to himself as a sexual pervert. He hated himself, which is why, and he loathed everything that he represented, which is why he writes the way he does. You can just see it. He was a psychopath, and psychopaths, what they do is they present their weaknesses on their opponents. Paul was born a psychopath, and his whole life is hideous. And almost everything the man says about his life, from studying to being a rabbi and being the best of the students, and the conversion on the road to Damascus, his affair with Stephen the martyr, all of it. I mean, every bit of it is a lie. No, he is not a guy that started off with good intentions and then made some mistakes, and Jews turned on him because he was, making a fool of himself. No, this man was vicious, perverted,
bad to the bone,
twisted. Was born a psychopath. It's
rotten from the
a man with no. The worst of all possible things. A man that's psychotic. A man who has an ego that's out of control. A man that has no empathy. A man who has absolutely no respect for right, wrong, truth, and lies. Does not value life.
And the world flocks to him. The world absolutely flocks to him.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, no, he's the worst of humanity.
Wow.
There is no reason to be sympathetic in the least. God calls him to play.
No, I wasn't trying to be sympathetic. I was just trying to if there was a point where he just really turned because of that, but he obviously was that way from the start.
Yeah, he went from just being frustrated and mean and vicious and perverted and disgusting psychopath, which is how he describes himself, to being Satan's apostle based upon what happened on the road to Damascus. So there was a turning point in his life. That's not to say a turning point. Psychopaths are evil. Psychopaths are deadly. Psychopaths are dishonest. Yeah, psychopaths are egomaniacs. Are vicious. He was all of those things. Nothing changed in that regard. He just became...
His tactics became smarter. He went from brute force to more manipulative and conniving.
Yeah, I would say, how about this? And in fact, I think he even wrote this in one place. He went from hunting down and killing scores of Jews to creating a religion that would annihilate millions of Jews. He changed his tactics from blunt force of his own hands to the blunt force
manipulation and
the pen.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he became the single most deadly, degrading, and despicable.
He went from Ted Bundy to
force.
Adolf Hitler.
Oh man, Adolf Hitler on
steroids.
Yeah, God's got nothing to say about Adolf Hitler, but man, does he have a lot to say about Shaul. I think Shaul's name is like mentioned something over 400 times.
Yeah, I think that's what you wrote. Yeah, it's probably, if I look it up, I'm sure I'll find it.
Yeah.
And then what was it? 66 more times is something, but.
Well, yeah, it's 66 times is used as actually as Sheol, and 406 times. 406 times it's used as in a reference to Shaul, and keep in mind that every time that the King Shaul is referenced, King Shaul he had virtually no effect on Israel. And so King Shaul exists in every respect. Tribe of Benjamin, anti-Torah, demon-possessed, deadly, and Dowd's enemy, to mirror
still synonymous.
The self-proclaimed apostle Shaul.
Right.
Every aspect of his life. The only reason we were told anything about him is he is a prototype for the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sounds like Asher.
Oh, the Asher has found a squeaky toy. I think it's called a wooba, a Kong wooba. And it is a squeak. I'm sorry for all the noise. Yes, it is a squeaky toy. So she's done her best to be patient. And Leigh and I went out to dinner and left her here, and so she's this evening, and so she's now letting us know that she's here and wants to play, and we ought not be ignoring her.
Yes.
Yeah.
You've had your time. Now pay attention to me.
You've had your time. Now it's my time. I've been patient here. I took a nap during your whole boring show, and now it's supposed to be over, and we're going to play. And we're going to play Wooba.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But old Asher got a long walk on the beach today and a big swim, and found a dog that she could play with on the beach, and so she had a good day. Life is good here. Yeah.
I'm happy for you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, we really like it. So, all right, fellas. This time next week, and look forward to it.
Same time.
Happy Shabbat.
Right.
Okay.
Shabbat shalom.
Happy Shabbat.
Good night, guys.
Shalom.
Night.